Almost every other day, headlines emerge about new carbon pricing schemes taking shape across the globe. But here's the catch. The cost per ton of carbon can vary wildly depending on where a company operates. Now, most of these programs only account for emissions generated within their own borders. But back in 2005, the European Union launched the world's first international emissions trading system, or ETS. Initially focused solely on emissions within EU territory, the EU ETS has since evolved into a regulatory force that now touches companies far beyond Europe's borders. I'm Johanna Bota, and joining me today to break it all down is StoneX's Vice President of Carbon Markets, Leah Wieczorek. Great to have you with us, Leah. Let's start off with giving us a quick overview of your role at StoneX.
Hello, Joanna. Thanks so much for having me today. Yeah, I'm part of StoneX Carbon Solutions team. And as part of my role, I manage our commercial activities for EMEA and APAC, where we're active in both the voluntary carbon market and a number of compliance markets, including the EU ETS.
Right. So let's start with the growing importance of the EU ETS for corporates with global operations. And to illustrate that, I want to focus on two industries that account for a significant share of carbon emissions. So let's begin with aviation, because since 2012, the EU emissions trading system has included the airline sector. Now, how significant is the EU ETS for aviation, and what kind of impact has it had so far?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as you said, since 2012, the EU ETS has included intra-EU flights, which refers to flights within the European Economic Area. International flights into or out of the EEA are currently excluded due to the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation, or in short, CORSIA. CORSIA is a global scheme that is currently in the voluntary phase. And while the EU is supporting CORSIA as a global framework under the International Civil Aviation Organization, they have previously been questioning whether CORSIA is ambitious enough and whether the scheme would delay real emission reductions. So I think it's justified to say that it seems like the EU is seeing CORSIA more as a floor. And in the coming year, the EU will review CORSIA again and decide on what actions to take. It is important to note that the EU has been aiming to include international flights from Europe into the EU ETS for a long time, but has faced a global backlash from countries like the US, China, and India. So in case the European Union is not satisfied with the CORSIA scheme after its next review, there is a chance that they will want to try expand the scheme again. Another scenario could be that CORSIA participants are found to not comply and that the EU would take action on this. The compliance deadline for CORSIA Phase 1 is January 2028, so we will likely know more by then. The majority of international airlines prefer to comply with CORSIA instead of the EU ETS, due to the lower cost per ton of carbon. But as you can see, there are many political uncertainties on whether there will be further coverage of the aviation industry under the EU ETS. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
So, another major transportation sector contributing significantly to carbon emissions is shipping, which was added to the EU ETS in 2024. Now, that's regardless of the vessel's country of origin. However, the regulation currently only applies to emissions within European waters. How does the inclusion of shipping under the EU ETS compare to the way aviation was brought into the system?
Yeah, so the shipping industry has been covered under the EU ETS since January 2024. The difference to the aviation sector here is that one, shipping industry has not received free allowances like the aviation industry did. And two, not only ships traveling within the EEA are covered. Ships that are traveling to and from Europe, 50% of the emissions are covered under the EU ETS. As you can see, this means that all of a sudden, a lot of international shipping companies that never had any exposure to the EU ETS, and most of them never heard of the EU ETS before, are covered under it. majority of the ship owners are passing down the costs of the EUAs to their clients. This means that not only international shipping companies have an exposure to the EU ETS, but pretty much every company shipping products into the EU has an indirect exposure. The EU ETS is a very volatile market, and prices for EUAs typically driven based on energy and economic conditions as well as policy changes. This means that corporates with a large exposure should consider how to best manage their exposure. As you can imagine, there are many different ways on how a corporate can procure EUAs, and our aim at StoneX is to support our clients making informed decisions that works best for their business. We provide our clients with information on market developments and also provide them with access to market and risk management solutions. Our aim really is to support all those international corporates that have never dealt with the EU ETS market before and get them to a point where they understand their exposure and also clearly know what are the ways that they can manage this exposure.
I see. Well, there's also this fairly new regulation, right? The CBAM, or Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And it's pretty much what it sounds like, right? If you're importing goods like steel, aluminum, or fertilizers into the EU, you now have to report the emissions tied to those products. What's the thinking behind this new approach?
Yes, so CBAM here is to level the playing field between the EU and non-EU producers of carbon-intensive goods. On the one hand, the EU wants to prevent carbon leakage by imposing a carbon cost on certain important goods, equivalent to what EU producers would pay. On the other hand, CBAM should send a clear signal to non-EU countries that if they do not price carbon, the export to the EU will face a carbon price. We're currently in the transitional phase of CBAM, and it currently applies to iron and steel, cement, aluminium, fertilizer, hydrogen, and electricity. There is a high likelihood of more carbon-intensive sectors being added soon. In the current phase, importers must report on their emissions and are asking exporters to provide the emission data. This alone can be quite a challenging task for businesses that are working with many different suppliers. Often there's a lack of data across the supply chain, so gathering alone the information can be challenging. In the future, importers of those products not only need to report on the emissions, but also need to purchase CBAM certificates. Now, what do CBAM certificates have to do with the EU ETS? Well, CBAM certificates are not tradable, but their pricing is linked to the weekly price of EUAs. So, for example, if the average EUA price is, let's say, 70 euros per ton that week, the price of each CBAM certificate will also be 70 euros. It's also important to note that CBAM is an evolving, and only recently the Parliament and the Council agreed to change on CBAM as part of the Omnibus 1 simplification package. There are a couple of changes under this new package, and I don't want to go into too much detail here, but the aim of this is to simplify the process and admin burden for corporates. One of the changes, for example, is that importers that are only importing up to 50 tons per annum would be exempted from CBAM rules. So as you can see, this new regulation makes the EU ETS even more meaningful for international companies. I mean, let's just say you're a steel manufacturer in China. Then first of all, the European importer of your products will need to purchase CBAM certificates linked to the EU ETS pricing. And two, if you ship your products into the EU, then you will likely be charged for the EUAs from your charterer.
But from what I understand, EUA prices can be quite volatile, and with these new regulations, a whole new group of international clients is now exposed to the EU ETS. What's the best way for clients to manage this exposure?
So part of my role at StoneX is to work closely with organizations that have an exposure to EU ETS, be it direct or indirect, and help them to understand the exposure and find suitable ways to manage it. It is also important that this can look very different to organizations, and unfortunately, there's no one-way-fits-it-all approach. For example, we work with some companies that have been hedging all kind of commodities for a long time. So for them, it's just really another asset that they're looking to hedge. For some other companies we're working with, we're seeing that they never looked into hedging. So it can be that our support is more in the form of educating counterparts on procurement and hedging approaches. All in all, I think its most crucial part for clients is that they understand their exposure and are aware of the different options they have on how to manage this exposure. If your company only has very little exposure to the EU ETS, then it might not make sense for you to put too much resources into looking at it. But if your organization has a large exposure, then this is something you definitely should look into more detail. And, just coming back to the very initial sentence, to the introduction that you made on all different countries bringing up different carbon scheme, I think that makes it even more difficult and challenging for international organizations to operate and to understand and navigate all those different exposures that all of a sudden they have because they're emitting in different jurisdictions. And that's really the aim, I would say, of the Carbon Solutions team, that we really hope and want to support our clients in different jurisdictions in the world, help them to understand those frameworks and really help them to manage it, be it the EU ETS or any other scheme.
I see, becoming a one-stop shop. Leah, thank you so much. It's been a very informative conversation. Appreciate you joining us. And thank you for watching. For more financial content like this, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.